Hello everyone. In this video, we will quickly review what we've covered in today's session. So we've learned about tides, time of tides, types of tides, and the different effects of tides. So we'll begin with the first goal, that is time of tides. If you look into this picture, this is page number 119 from your textbook. Now the first goal for today's class is to understand type of tides. Now, if you look into this picture, you will see that how high tide has taken place at 12 noon. There's low tide again at 6:12 p.m., high tide at 12:25. Similarly, low tide at 6:37 a.m. and then again there's high tide at 12:50 p.m., which is on the next day. Now, from this picture, we can interpret that the time of tides changes every day, isn't it? So the time of tides changes every day. So you cannot have high tide on the same day or on the next day. You cannot expect high tide to take place at the same time. Now, what is the reason for time of tides to change every day? So that is what we're going to look at. Now, why does the time of tide changes every day? I'll quickly summarize what is given here in this paragraph. Now, the time of tides changes every day because tides are basically caused because of two important elements here: Earth and moon. They play a very important role for the arrival of tides. Now, why does the time of tide changes every day? Is because Earth and moon, they are both rotating, isn't it? The heavenly body which both rotates, and both rotates from west to east. So because Earth and moon are rotating and they both rotate from east to west to east, because they revolve at a different rate. So when they are rotating, Earth rotates slightly faster, so they revolve at a different rate. So because of which the time of one tide to another tide also changes. Now, if you get a question, why does time of tide changes every day? It is because Earth and moon, they revolve, okay, and they both revolve, they rotate from west to east, and when they revolve, they are revolving at a different rate. The Earth revolves slightly faster than the moon. So when they revolve at different rate, the time of one tide to another is likely to change, because Earth and moon are the two important forces that leads to the formation of tides. And because they are rotating at a different rate, and they both rotate from west to east, and but they are at a different rate, because so one arrives slightly faster than the other one, because of which tides, the time of one tide to another tide also changes. So that is what is explained here. You don't have to understand the formula behind working, that has been reduced from the syllabus, removed from the syllabus. So you just have to know why does time of tide changes every day. So just try to understand that tides do not occur at the same time every day. It changes every day. Why does it change every day? It is because of the role of Earth and moon, because both rotates in the same direction, that is west to east, but the rate at which they rotate are slightly different. Earth rotates faster than the moon. So because Earth and moon revolves at a different rate, the time of one tide to another also changes. Okay, so that is the next thing. Next term that you have to know is what is lunar day. We've learned what is lunar day. Lunar day is basically the time taken by the moon to complete one revolution, one rotation around its axis with respect to the sun. Okay, so lunar day is basically, it's a time taken by the moon to complete one rotation on its axis with respect to sun. Then third thing that we've learned in this paragraph is what is tide interval. Tide interval is basically, from the word, it's an interval, means difference. Okay, so the period of time between two high tide is called tide interval, and tide interval for two high tide is always 12 hours 25 minutes. This you have to know. So the difference in which the other tide will occur will always be 12 hours 25 minutes. For example, if you look here, 12 noon, one high tide has occurred. Okay, now for the next high tide to occur, what would be the time interval? 12 hours 25 minutes. Now if you look into this time, exactly after 12 hours 25 minutes, the next high tide has occurred. So that difference between two high tide is known as a tide interval, and you have to know what do you mean by tide interval. And what is the tide interval? It is always 12 hours 25 minutes. Okay, that you have to know from here. So three things we have learned. Why does time of tide changes every day? Second, what do you mean by lunar day? And the third is what is tide interval, and what is the tide interval between two high tides? Is always 12 hours 25 minutes. Now, moving to the second goal for today's class, types of tides. So, we're going to look at the different types of tides. Basically, there are two main types of tide. One is a spring tide, and second is a neap tide. So, we'll start with the first one. Spring tide is basically a very powerful tide. So it's known as a very powerful tide. So let's try to understand what is spring tide. So first we will underline when does it occur. Spring tides occur on a full moon day and on new moon day. So this is first thing that you have to remember, when does it occur. Now there are many forces. The two main forces, basically the force of moon and sun, are very important for spring tide to take place. So with the help of another picture, I would not be using this picture that is in text, but rather I'll use another picture, a simple picture, to help you understand the formation of spring tide. So moving to the next. Alright, so we will underline. Second thing about spring tide, the position of the sun, moon and earth are in a straight line on both full moon and new moon day. So spring tide takes place, the first thing we learned is that spring tide takes place on a full moon and new moon day. The second thing we learned that the position of the sun, moon and earth are always in a straight line. So sun, moon and earth will have to be on the same line for spring tide to take place. So what happens when they are in a straight line? Please underline. Forces are united at two opposite positions on the earth, meaning moon and sun, they combine their forces. So as a result, what happens? So there is greater force and greater pull of seawater. High tide of spring tide is higher than the average high tide, and the low tide of spring tide is lower than the average low tide. So this you must know. And the last thing is the range of tide, that is maximum in the case of spring tide, is known as amplitude of tide. So the difference between high and low tide, which is very high in the case of spring tide, is known as amplitude of tide. Now I'll quickly explain what we've underlined just now. So this is a picture of your spring tide. The first thing we learned, that spring tide takes place on a full moon and new moon day. Okay. Second thing we learned, that sun, earth and moon are in a straight line. Two things you have to remember for spring tide is that, so they take place on a new moon and full moon. New moon and full moon meaning the sun, the moon and the earth are all in a straight line. So what happens when they are in a straight line? As it is, we've learned that the gravitational pull of moon is really high because it is closer to the earth. If you look at the distance between moon and the earth, it's very close. So definitely the pull, this force is really strong. So moon can really pull the water. These are your water bodies which is being pulled by the moon. But because on a spring tide, the sun is also on the same line. So sun is also here. But even though sun is far from the earth, but the sun gives more power to the moon. So moon has extra power now to pull more water. So that is why spring tide, the tides are very high than the normal high tides. So the tides during spring tide are very high, okay, not the regular high tide, but the high tides are really high because of the combined gravitational pull of the sun and the moon. The sun and the moon, they combine together the force and they pull more water. That is why the high tide is very high in spring tide. So that is what you have to remember along with this picture. So spring tide meaning really powerful tide. They take place on a new moon and full moon when the sun, moon and earth are in a straight line. S for spring, S for straight line. So try to connect. What happens when they're in a straight line? When they are in a straight line, there is a combined. So the sun and the moon, they have the combined. They combine the energy in pulling more water. That is why spring tides are have really very high tides. Okay, so that is about spring tides. Moving to the second tide, that is the neap tide. So when do neap tide occur? Neap tide occurs during the first and the last quarter of the moon. At this position, the sun, moon and earth are at right angle. High tide of the neap tide is lower than the normal high tide. So low tide of the neap tide is higher than the normal or average tide. So this is what you have to remember. So neap tide basically occurs in the first and last quarter of the moon. This is very important. Sun, moon and earth are not in a straight line now, rather they are at right angles. So if you look into this picture, earth is here, moon and sun. So if you look into how they are at right angle. Alright, so I'll explain with the help of another picture that I have attached in this next slide. So neap tide occurs when sun, moon and earth are not in a straight line, rather they are in a right angle. Okay, so this is what is important. They are at right angle. So let's look at it. Sun is here, earth is here, and the moon is here. So if you look into this, this is a right angle, isn't it? So what happens? We've learned that the high tide is very low. So the high tide of neap tide is very weak or low. So meaning the water level will rise, but it is not that powerful. So why is it not powerful? Because as it is, the moon will have a great gravitational pull. So definitely the moon is closer to the earth. That is why they will again pull. The moon will again pull. So the water bulges out here. There's high tide here. Okay, but sun, since it's far from the earth, it cannot pull the water so much. That is why there is low tide, because the sun cannot, the gravitational pull of the sun is low, because sun, even though it's a huge heavenly body, the mass is it's really the weight of the sun is heavy, the mass is great, but yet because of the distance, the gravitational force becomes weak, because gravitational force is always powerful when the objects are closer. So because the sun is further away, that is why it cannot pull. That is why there is low tide experience. So whenever there is neap tide, the position of sun, moon and earth are right angle, and the high tide is very weak during neap tide. That's why neap tide also known as weak tides. Okay, so this is the picture of neap tide. So that is what we've learned. We've learned about two important types of tide. One is a spring tide, which is a very powerful tide. Takes place when sun, moon and earth are in a straight line. Because of the combined gravitational pull, the high tides are really high. Neap tide takes place when sun, moon and earth are at right angle. Moon will have a gravitational pull, that's why high tide will occur with this moon. But sun, since it's far away, the gravitational pull is not that much. That's why the high tide of neap tide are very weak. Okay, so that is what we've underlined. Now, few terms here. The moon is closer to the earth. When the moon is closer to the earth, we call it as perigee. When the sun is closer to the earth, we call it as perihelion. So spring tide is higher on these days. So spring tide is really high during perigee and perihelion, because sun and moon are closer to the earth. So any time for a gravitational force or a centrifugal force to be higher, the object has to be closer. So on these two dates, when perigee and perihelion, when the sun and the moon are closer to the earth, spring tide is very, very high. Okay, now next, moving on to what is a tidal board. This is not a type of tide, but this is just a subtopic for you to know what is a tidal board. We learned that uh, at the time of high tide, sea water enters into a channel of river through river mouth. As the direction of river water and the direction of sea are opposite to each other, the front portion of the tidal wave grows in height and stands as a wall. These walls are known as a tidal bore. So I'll explain with the help of this picture that is attached here, 12.31. So this is a normal situation. So the river is flowing this way. Now the river is about to, join the larger body, that is the sea. So this point where the river ends up, and then it is about to join the larger body, that is what is known as a river mouth of a river, meaning where the river now has finally uh, joining the larger water body, that is the seas or ocean. So that point is known as the river mouth. So what is the tidal bore now? So when there's high tide, what happens? The river is flowing this way, where sea water is flowing this way. So because river and sea water are flowing at two different directions, one is flowing this way, one is flowing this way, so because of which there's a wall like water that is that's grows in height. A wall like water grows in height. That wall like water is known as a tidal bore, and this mostly takes place in high tide. So that is what is known as a tidal bore. Okay, when the river and water and the sea water are flowing opposite direction, because of which there is a wall like structure that stands up, grows, that is what is known as the tidal bore. And the last thing that we learned was merits and demerits of tides today. So we also looked at the picture. This is a position. Perihelion, 2nd January, when the earth and the sun are closer to each other. Ephelion, when July 2nd, when they are far away from each other. So closer meaning spring tide is going to take place. Tides are high. Okay. Neap tide. Perigee, when earth and moon are closer, which means again high tide or spring tide. Apogee, when moon and earth are further away, again there is chances of low tide. So that is what we've learned. So these are just terms that you can remember for the two heavenly bodies to be closer and further away, and the term that is used for that. Now, moving to the last goal for today's class, we learned about the merits and demerits of tides. So, we started with the merits or advantages of tides. First, with the help of tides, ports have been able to um, facilitate. That is why we have been able to use economic activities, have been able to flourish, trades have been able to flourish. So what is the level of seawater increases at the time of high tide? As a result, the depth of the water near the ports also increases. So definitely when the depth increases, ships are able to enter the port, isn't it? If the depth of the water is really shallow, you cannot have ships entering the port area, so your port will not be of any function. But because of high tides, the water level increases, because of which your ports can also be open, and then large ships will be able to enter. So when ships are able to enter, we can engage in trade, and then help our economy to grow. So that's the first advantage of tides. Second, tides help in the cleaning of coastal area. During low tides, when they take away all the rubbish collected along the coast and port areas, low tides also remove sediments brought by river and deposit the mouth and in the port area. This necessary depth of the water is maintained. This helps the ship to reach the harbors. The second is the coast tides, especially low tides, just removes all the rubbish that has been collected in the land area, and even the deposition of sand gets removed. So because if there is no tides taking place, what will happen? The sand will start keeping, the waves will keep on accumulating a lot of sand, so that will not facilitate your ships to be used. So tides are very important because they help in cleaning of the coastal area and even maintaining the depth of the water. Third, we can harness tidal energy. As we all know, we can harness tidal energy, which can be used for the generation of electricity, conservation of biodiversity. The flora and fauna could be maintained because tides help in the distribution of plankton, which is a food for the fish. So flora, fauna, and can be really maintained with help of tides. Salt pans, the seawater when they entered salt pans is blocked from flowing back to the sea, and the evaporation stored creates salts. So basically, salt pan is a very common phenomena in areas which are close to the coastal areas. They maintain a lot of blocking of water during high tide and not allowing it to go back. And this water, which is stored, undergoes a process of evaporation and then produces salt ultimately. Tides even prevent the coastal from freezing because tides produce disturbance in water because the water starts mixing up when there's high tide and low tide. So the saline water of sea mixes with the fresh water during tide. This way, the tides prevent the coastal area from being freezing. Tides are useful for fishing, as we all know how fishermen go deep into the sea during low tide, which facilitate fishing. Tides even help in the reduction of water pollution because tides help in the cleaning of coastal areas, of removal of solid waste, and this can help in reducing water pollution. So that is those are some of the merits of tides. And here, this is what salt pan looks like. So during high tide, when the water reaches the coast, the water is stored and not allowed to go back. So these are pans where waters are stored, and when evaporation takes place, ultimately they result in the formation of salt. So they can extract a lot of salt with the help of tides as well. And moving to the last portion, demerits of tides or drawbacks of tides. Damage to ships and boats, especially in the areas with really high tides. It can damage, and it can a lot of bring a lot of damage to ships and boats and even life and property. Second is accumulation of sand. The accumulation of sand decreases at the depth of the sea at this point. As a result, when the accumulation of sand takes place, sometimes because of the really high tide, a lot of accumulation of sand takes place. When these sands get accumulated, what happens? It obstructs the entry of ships because the water level becomes very shallow because of the deposition. So there can be a lot of drawbacks of tides as well. So this is what we've learned in today's class. We've learned about why this time of tide changes every day. We've learned about what is a lunar day. We've learned about what is tide interval. We've learned about spring and neap tide, and we have to know the position of the sun, moon, and earth for each tide. And the last portion was your merits and demerits of tides. Thank you. I hope you were able to understand. If you have any questions, you're always welcome to get back. Thank you for watching.